Good morning, all. So, my name is Radha Krishna Rao, Secretary, ACFE Hyderabad chapter. I'm happy, very happy, and take pleasure in welcoming you all to this August gathering, August virtual gathering. So, ACFE Hyderabad is in its nascency. In fact, we have started just 2.5 years ago. It is our second annual conference. First conference we conducted during April 2019, and we thought of conducting this year's conference also in the month of April. But as we all know, this pandemic, this unforeseen pandemic, made our dreams unattainable, in fact. However, this virtual gathering also gave us a better opportunities, an opportunity to listen to the highly acclaimed international speakers, and also we have an opportunity to meet all the esteemed guests from different chapters across the country. So in fact, I do not want to take much time, but before inviting my president for his introductory, I would like to say a few words. You see, for all the sessions, we have very good speakers, internationally prominent speakers we have invited. So we intend to take feedback for all the sessions. I request the participants to actively participate in the feedback, and there are some interactions. Some of the speakers, they will have some interactions, and we also have quiz programs. We conduct 2 quiz programs, one program today and another program tomorrow. And we have the prizes also for the winners and runners in each of the quiz programs. Each quiz contains 2 questions, and we'll give 60 seconds for each question. For the winners, we give $25 worth Amazon voucher. For the runner-up, $15 Amazon voucher. Similarly, we'll play Wheel of Fortune twice a day, today and tomorrow, during tea break, during tea breaks, second at the end of the session. And winner means the name selected by the wheel will be given $25 worth Amazon voucher. So I request all the people, all the participants to participate actively, and if you have any questions, please post it in the Q&A section. If you have any message to be shared, please post in the chat section, because we have a huge gathering. Still they are entering, so we cannot enable audio and video. Still, if anybody wants to put a question verbally, please raise your hand at the end of the session so that our host will enable you and you can speak. So videos we cannot allow to avoid any bandwidth and other technical problems. That is all. So with this, I'll close.
Radha Krishna garu, tell about the Mentimeter, all the sessions.
Online will do. The feedback will be taken on mentimeter.com. Quiz is also conducted on that. We will give instructions, and the URLs, codes, whatever it is there, we will display on the screen. It will be easy. And now I will close, and I don't take much time. I welcome and I request our President, Mr. Sharath Kumar, to give him introductory talk. Mr. Sharath Kumar.
Very good morning, friends here, my colleagues from the board of Hyderabad chapter, and also I heartily welcome Mr. Dorris, who kindly agreed to share this session and addresses also. I'll take few minutes of preamble. The new normal, when we are thinking of what should be the theme of this annual conference, we felt naturally the pandemic has given rise to new opportunities to fraudsters, naturally forcing the anti-fraud professionals to evolve themselves by observing what is happening around them and how to fight the fraud better. The best part of the pandemic is both the fraudsters and the anti-fraud professionals have ample time by the forced recluse at their respective residences, wherein they honed their skills in perpetrating fraud and also fighting the fraud. Post-COVID scenario increased the digital footprints in an enormous scale, which enabled the fraudsters also to perpetrate digital frauds on a scale unprecedented and unheard of, which is resulting in losses of millions of dollars or affecting lakhs of people. And in this new normal, estimated increase in fraud is supposed to be 40% increase in new attempt to open the new account fraud and 20% increase in the takeover of the accounts fraud. Both are this thing. But as fraud fighters, we should not permit this 1% of the bad apples to take over and hijack the good services to be rendered by the online services as well as the regular services to the 99% good customers. The most important thing I'm going to share with you tomorrow in my session, but which I thought fit to mention here is one new evolution post-pandemic I observed, which is very relevant to all of us, is synthetic identity fraud. I'll take only half minute in elaborating it. This is on the highest count today. Synthetic identity fraud is different from the regular identity fraud in the sense that the fraudsters, having all the time at their disposal, they are creating half-truth and the rest half is the fraudulent portion. The half-truth is enabling the people dealing with them to believe that they are dealing with the truth and getting cheated. I'll cover tomorrow. Synthetic fraud is on the right. So what do we do in these circumstances? It should be countered with the help of equal, if not better, anomaly discussion, anomaly detection, customer education, data sharing. Data sharing is most important. Unfortunately, it is my passion to see all agencies who are fighting frauds from respective institutions, still they are not sharing the confidential data in fighting the fraud with each other. Today, it is the order of the world. Fraudsters should be taught a lesson. Only and only anti-fraud professionals across the board and across the should be able to share their data. We should be able to create a collective intelligence data network in this to fight the frauds in the new pandemic. And the most and last important thing we have to do to observe, learn, and counter, and honing to be very skilled and very professional in a real-time basis. That should be the order of the day. The last point before I sign off will be frequent should be the order of the day, and more conferences are possible today without attending internationally physically. It's quite comfortable to sit in your respective home or office and share the data with your colleagues. I encourage all my colleague anti-fraud professionals world over to share the data on a real-time continuous basis to enable us to fight the fraud. And I take the opportunity to welcome Mr. Dorris, our international president of the ACFE. He is he serves as an advisory member to ACFE Board of Regents also. Dorris has anti-fraud training for the United Nations, the American Bankers Association, which is very prestigious, colleges, universities around the world, as well as with the FBI and GAO and other federal and state law enforcement agencies in US. Very important experience. His expertise has been featured in interview with the CNBC's American Greed, ABC The Economist, Fortune, the BBC, the Atlantic, among others. Dorris earned his juris doctorate and is licensed to practice law in Texas as well as in Louisiana. Prior to joining the ACFE, he served as a prosecutor, and successful one at that, in Louisiana for Dorris has been with the ACFE for the past 14 years, previously serving as vice president and in the program director. I wholeheartedly welcome Bruce Dorris to deliver. Thank you. Over to Bruce Dorris.
Me to be a part of this event today. The chapter in Hyderabad is putting on a wonderful virtual conference for you. It would be my honor to be there in person, as I would love to be able to be traveling and to be in your presence, networking with you and being a part of this outstanding event. Unfortunately, not only you in India, but us in the United States and everywhere in the world is impacted by COVID-19, restricting our travel, restricting our ability to network and to do what we like to do as human beings and to be together. And in our professional environment as fraud examiners, being able to talk about what we do professionally and how we're able to combat fraud globally. And we just can't do that in person anymore. But thank goodness for technology and the ability to communicate this way, talk to one another, and to continue our learning environment, albeit virtually. And so it's great information that I want to share with you today to start your conference and to be a part of it. One of the things that was very important to us at the ACFE was putting on our global report to the nations. Many of you have saw this back in April when it was first launched. This is a report that we have done for a number of years now. It is one of the studies that has been very consistent for many, many years. We started this in 1996. For those of you who have been CFEs for a very, very long time, you'll remember that that report, that global fraud study, when it first came out. Back in those days, it was a hand survey. So in other words, it was 6 pages that were sent to certified fraud examiners for them to fill out and to send back into us. And so what we would do is spread them out over a table and go through and compartmentalize, putting that information together to share to members. And it has grown significantly since then. I mean, you're talking about just a few hundred people to now we have over 2,500 certified fraud examiners that are a part of this and that talk about and discuss with over 70, nearly 80 questions, really pinpointing fraud that has occurred within their organization, whether it be in the private sector, a public entity, government, wherever that certified fraud examiner is working, and getting information to where they can send it to us. It is sanitized so that the names and the individual are not made public, but it allows us to really get a deep understanding of how fraud is occurring, who is it being committed by, how long is it lasting, that type of information. And when you go back to 1996, when we first kicked off this study, it really helped us to understand the common characteristics of fraud and the risk profiles of those who have committed fraud. We had many, many questions from the media, especially back in those days, because they wanted to know, well, how much does fraud cost? Well, we have to really understand who's doing it and how, what we're up against, and to try to tell them, like, we can't tell you how much fraud is out there, simply because there's so much that has been undiscovered. And what we've done is take this report so that we could show in the media, we could show members, we could show your industry, this is how it's impacting you. And we based those estimates. And so many CFEs estimate that about 5% of their revenues are lost due to fraud. And when you start looking at that and extrapolating that across the world, that's a lot of money that is lost due to fraud. And so we grew on that premise in the mid 1990s to where we are today. And it is such a detailed, robust report. And so I want to share that with you, but I want to take a little bit of a detour because of this little thing we call COVID-19 and the pandemic that has ensued from it. Because as I mentioned, and many of you know this, we put the report out in April. Well, of course, that had been going on for several months as we pulled that information together. And the report was ready to launch in April, and COVID-19 hit at least in March in the United States and so many other places in the world before that. And we decided in April, after the launch of the report to the nations, the global fraud study, that we would look to see how are fraud examiners being impacted by COVID-19. And so at that point, we started releasing, or rather in May, we released that information based off the questions that we had sent to fraud examiners to see how COVID-19 was impacting their operations. We asked 12 questions on that particular survey. Many of you have seen the various iterations of this. How is COVID affecting the overall level of fraud? What specific fraud risk has COVID-19 impacted within your organization, within your entity? And how has it impacted the anti-fraud programs and, most importantly, budget? How is your organization dealing with this? Are they cutting the resources that you would have for the control measures that you had in place for fraud? And so we wanted to find out what those prominent challenges were for various organizations that CFEs were members of. So when we look at this first question, think about this, and I have asked this to a number of groups. As an anti-fraud professional, has your job changed compared to it was 9 months ago when the pandemic began? Has it become more challenging? Has it stayed about the same? And a few people have mentioned that it was easier, but the vast majority have indicated that their jobs are incredibly more challenging now, as you can imagine, due to the difficulty level of doing your job. If you look at the slide that I have up here, when you look at on the far left, what is more challenging here, especially when it comes to preventing and also investigating fraud. If you think about it, how we are as CFEs, we're disruptors. We go in, we audit, we investigate. We are going into systems to check to see whether or not fraud has taken place, and we interrupt business activities in order to do that in many cases. And what happened is COVID-19 has completely stopped us from doing a lot of those things. We are no longer able to travel. We are no longer able to physically interview people. We're having to do things remotely. And so because of that, you see the statistic there with about 75%, their jobs have become more challenging based off what has happened over the last several months. With things so disrupted and the inability for us to communicate with one another, the inability to be a part of the process that we have had and are used to for so long, depending on where it is that you would need to be conducting that interview or that investigation or getting that evidence. Do they have the same type of information technology that you have? Is there an issue there in order to communicate? So many different variables that we are now having to deal with. So the challenge is obviously there. And then when you couple that with this particular slide, you see that 77% of the respondents observed an increase in fraud. This was as of August of 2020. And next week, we should release the most recent studies. I've had a sneak peek, and I will share them with you at the chapter. It is about the same. And so we have seen, perhaps it's slightly larger depending on the sector, but we have seen that increase in fraud due to this pandemic. There is no doubt that we are seeing that. Why? Because fraudsters don't stop. If you went back and looked at the previous report, if you want to go and look, I'll tell you what happened. May of this year, only about 65, 68% of CFEs reported seeing an increase in fraud. That jumped up 10% by August. Why? Because we're able to, back in May or in April when the questions went out, we're still struggling. We're still trying to figure out what's happened. Now we've got our legs. We know what we're dealing with now. We're still not at 100%, obviously, but we're trying to work through the system of a lack of control measures, of a lack of information technology, all these issues that we're dealing with. Now we're seeing that fraud. Why? Because fraudsters are taking advantage of our inability to do what we previously did. And that is reflected in this report, and you'll see some of the areas of how that relates to the report to the nations as well. You look at this particular slide, and what I'm going to do during our time together is talk to you about how the report to the nations and the COVID-19 study are something that you can use in order to talk to your management, those who are funding you, those whether they are clients, of why it is important to continue anti-fraud controls during this pandemic. Because you see what happened even without a pandemic. And I mentioned this earlier, over 2,500 cases were part of the report to the nations, the study from over 125 countries. And there is one, if you want to go and look at it, on the ACFE.com website relating to the Asia Pacific region, including India, and some statistics related to just those parts of the world, or if you're working in other parts of Asia, it's something that you can go and look at if you want to see data on a very particular level. But globally, this is what we're looking at. CFE is estimating, as I mentioned earlier, about 5% of revenue to fraud is lost each year. And sadly, that median loss in US dollars being well into 6 figures. And then the average loss per case, primarily due to financial statement fraud, well over $1 million. Now, going back to the COVID-19 report, and I tell you, I'm going to work through both of these reports and to leave you with some really good, strong information to move forward with. The change in the overall level of fraud, and we talked about this just a few moments ago, of that increasing from 68% to 77%. This is going to continue to change because we're seeing more, we're discovering more. Why? Because particular lines may be drying up. If you think about it from a cash flow perspective, Warren Buffett, one of the great investors in the world, investing in many companies, he has a saying that is, it's only when the tide goes out do we discover who's been swimming naked. And what happens is when we're able to see everything, we're able to see companies. We saw this with Wirecard in Europe. When those lines of credit are called and that cash is no longer there due to your financial statement, what becomes financial statement fraud. We are able to really discover this. And because of the relaxing of accounting rules, the accounting estimates that are going to be out, that based off the last several months, because fraudsters are, especially those are within the occupational fraud and abuse category, are going to be using that to their advantage to elongate those frauds that they were trying to cover up before. They know that those lines are exposed now, and they want to take advantage of anything that regulators, fraud examiners, auditors will give them. And so we need to be mindful of that as we move forward. If we cannot lose our professional skepticism. Even though we're in a pandemic, and even though we can't see those who we are auditing, those who we are investigating, those who we are working with or for, we must maintain that professional skepticism, because that is the only way that we can see whether or not this fraud is rising. And I cannot stress that enough, especially when you look at the possibilities. When you look at the report to the nations, the 43% of the cases dealing with corruption, only 10%, but the median loss being nearly $1 million US as it relates to financial statement fraud. And then the majority of the cases, 86%, but with just a median loss of $100,000. So you see that inverse relationship. And it's important that we make sure that we reassess our risk. We make sure that we have allocated resources effectively. Because if we are going after, say, some minor travel and entertainment expense at the ultimate expense of missing out on those financial statement fraud possibilities, we've got to make sure that we're not spending our what few resources that we have. We'll make sure that we're putting it in the right place. Now, this is going to be different for any organization, and I certainly want to make sure that travel and entertainment abuse, yeah, that is. But if we're seeing an increase of travel and entertainment expenses, our professional skepticism will tell us, hey, wait, we're in a pandemic. No one should be going anywhere, right? And so it's maintaining that skepticism, maintaining our being fresh about what is happening in our organizations. But we need to be mindful of, from our history, going back many, many years, that financial statement fraud, even though fewer number of cases, it's the one that really impacts an organization the most. Now, some of the things that came out of our COVID-19 study, as you can imagine, cyber fraud is one of the areas of fraud that have increased the most. And you see that has constantly ticked up over between May and August, and expected to increase over the next several months. I mean, that is where fraudsters are able to take advantage of systems, and they are certainly doing that. Phishing, business email compromise, ransomware, the inability to deal with vendors the way you had before, a true understanding of way cloud computing works, and some vulnerabilities there. I mean, these are all good things that we use in order to work remotely. But we also need to be mindful that fraudsters are going to try to take advantage of that remote activity to infiltrate our systems, to get our data, to steal your money. So we've got to be mindful of that. And then also, I mean, if you think about the issues that we're dealing with, many of you are working from home still. And if you think back in months past, we start to drop our guard after a while. If you think about when you are in an office and you're physically in an office and you leave to go to another office or walk down a hall, you typically are going to shut down your computer and lock it up as you've been trained and as a good fraud examiner, and making sure that no one can get in there. But do you do the same thing at home? Maybe, maybe not. But think about what's around there. You're thinking, well, there's no fraudsters here. But your 3-year-old may be there who likes to play with keys and then may come in there and do something that impacts not just your computer, but the network for that. Now, I'm using that as an example, but we need to understand that we cannot let our guard down. Whether it's just an accident like that or the real thing in dealing with cyber criminals that are trying to infiltrate our systems. and being aware to, in being ready to update our fraud risk and provide the training that is necessary in order to adequately defend against that type of a fraudster. We've also seen quite a bit of fraud related to employee embezzlement. The ability and the lack of being at our offices anymore have really impacted our fraud examiners being able to go in and reconcile and do just a number of things that they would have before. If you notice, fraud examiners also expect this to be just behind where cyber fraud is in relation to what is expected to increase over the next year. Bribery and corruption, the same way. We're seeing that continually trending up, and fraud examiners expecting to see that increase as well. So with this risk still around, and now more is added because of COVID-19 in your organization and in your industry, we have to really ask ourselves the question, has your organization updated its fraud risk in the last 6 to 9 months? Now, we have to think through this. And when I ask this to groups, it generally has been split here of that, yes, we have updated, or we need to. Now, I'm hoping that as we talk about this more, in Fraud Week just a few weeks ago, that we're able to really understand what that risk is, that this will continue to, or we're able to see more of that specific updating in light of COVID-19. Why? Because of this. Look at this slide. This is from the report to the nations. 40% of the concealment methods used by fraudster were related to fraudulent physical documents. 36% altered physical documents. How many of you have actually even gone to your office to open the mail from the post? Probably not many. And so when we start looking at those two, when we have the report to the nations again in about 2 years, I'm wondering how much of that is going to change due to COVID-19 and everything being remote or virtual or electronic now. And so this tells us that we have got to make certain that we conduct a fraud risk assessment as it relates to our organization in order to really stop fraudsters and think about what they're doing and how they're changing. Because this slide tells us that what we were doing before was good, but we have a whole new monster in front of us now that is coming at us, that is attacking us in a virtual platform that we did not necessarily have the resources in place before. But we must, it is imperative that we do so now. When you look at the detection rate, and this is a great slide to really show, especially to employers, of the passive versus proactive methodology as it relates to our detection and our controls. You can see up there at the top that median loss and median duration. We don't want to be in those top 3. That's almost by, as you can see there, by accident. We want to be more proactive. And those that have those types of controls in place, we've got a good IT control. We have some type of continuous monitoring within our organization, that continuous audit process. That is where you start to see those numbers drop down in terms of actual amount that's lost, as well as the duration it takes us to catch it. That is a success. And we have seen this continually go down, that I'll share with you in just a moment, over the years as we have been conducting this study. But we've really got to invest specifically in those IT controls, or at least keep up from cutting those costs and making sure that our employers manage and don't decrease funding so that we're not trying to make that back up. Because if we the more that is decreased, the more funding that is cut as it relates to those controls that impact fraud. You think about that on the profit margin of an organization. I mean, think about how that has to extrapolate in terms of revenue later to make up for that fraud loss that was on the bottom line. But for just a small amount that we're able, for a hotline even, some of these controls can be expensive, but some are relatively inexpensive. But just making sure that we have those in place. This is if your organization doesn't have one, you can see that 64% of the organizations that were part of the report to the nations, the global fraud study, had those hotlines. Those who had it were half of what those who of the loss, half of the loss of those who did not. And then you see the duration, we're able to discover it more quickly as well. That's what's paramount with what we need to do as fraud examiners, is making sure that at a minimum, we've got those controls in place. So if you look at the next slide, the effect of the employee fraud awareness training. This is something I stress so much, especially now because we're virtual. We have that ability to talk and communicate that way. 48% of cases were detected by tip. That's great, but they have to know what to do with it, right? We have to give them training. So if you can see the cases without training versus the cases that were found with training, far more successful. Use the time, use that virtual environment in order to increase that. The use of targeted anti-fraud controls has increased so much, and we are so thankful that you as CFEs are trying to do this and to carry that water, to carry it forward, to keep that our organizations fit fiscally so that we're not losing money due to fraud. And that lack of internal controls contributed to nearly 1/3 of those fraud. Just a small investment can do so much. If there's anything that you take away, though, take away the bottom part of that slide. The presence of anti-fraud controls is associated with 1, lower fraud losses, and 2, quicker detection. The data shows it, it's proven, we should adhere to it. Now, as we've been mentioning, 92% expect an increase of fraud in the coming months. There is much, much to be done. Have our budgets been cut? Fortunately, the data that I have seen from talking with members, talking with corporate alliance partners, is that they are making sure that we are funding. And so you can see from this slide that very few are actually cutting those programs. Now, obviously, travel for anti-fraud staff, that is cut simply because there's nowhere to go. We can't travel anywhere. It's not like that you can get on a plane, or at least several months ago, and go to Delhi. I mean, it can't happen right now. So that's understandable. But it's good to see that the level of anti-fraud staffing and the investment in technology is still at no change, or there's even a slight increase. Why? Because U.S. fraud examiners are telling management that we recognize there's a problem and we have got to invest more here. This is how we're going to stop this fraud from taking place. What are the prominent challenges? Obviously, the inability to travel is one of them. Challenges in remote interviews. And we're losing that touch. We're losing that dimension of being able to see someone in person. And this is the hand that we have been dealt, and we must find a way to work through it. So what are your takeaways? Obviously, update your fraud risk assessment. Make sure that we have got a good plan to go forward with. We talk to HR, we talk to legal, we talk to IT, we talk to accounting to make sure that we understand the risks they're in now, that since we're remote and we have months to go, even though a vaccine is around the corner, we still have a long way to go, and we must plan for that. Revisit your fraud awareness training. take advantage of the time that your employees are not commuting, and give them that opportunity to have a more robust fraud risk management atmosphere within your organization. Continue to educate everyone, not only those in the fraud staff or internal audit, but upper management, and that first line of defense of your organization is critical in order to understand fraud. And you just talk to one another, collaborate. Even though we're not in person, we can still communicate and talk to one another. And I encourage you to also go to the ACFE.com site. There are 2 different studies that we talked about today, but there's a lot more information on there relating to COVID-19, and a resource page that we have dedicated to fraud examiners dealing with this issue. It has been my pleasure to be a part of this event, and I wish you a very successful virtual conference, and I cannot wait to see you all in person again. Bye.
Yeah. That is an amazing inaugural, Mr. Bruce. Thank you so much. In spite of a huge time gap and in spite of our chapter being a nascent one, you have accepted our request for the inaugural address. You have made it. It's a wonderful speech. Though it's brief, you have covered so many aspects. You have excellently covered the important aspects of the latest report, the report to the nations on occupational fraud. Yes, Mr. Bruce, you are very true that technology helped us immensely in these times of pandemic. And that's horrific that 5% of revenues are lost due to occupational fraud. And as you told, CFEs have an important role in containing this this epidemic. In fact, as you said, there is increase in frauds, and as you expected in your speech that there is likely to be increase to the extent of 92%. We have a great role, and it made the lives of our CFEs more challenging. As you told, so whatever may be the situation, whether it is pandemic or otherwise, we must maintain our professional skepticism, or else we cannot be successful in defeating the fraud. And we have to invest more in our fight against fraud. Thank you, Mr. Bruce, for such a wonderful words.